Alright, listen up. What if I told you that one of the darkest, most terrifying events in human history wasn't just a tragedy, but also, paradoxically, a bizarre catalyst for, well, almost everything we consider modern? We're talking about the Black Death. This wasn't just a bad time, it was a cosmic reset button that fundamentally reshaped Europe, kickstarting transformations that echo even in your phone, your job, and your very existence today. Think of it as history's most aggressive out with the old, in with the drastically new initiative. Buckle up, because this story is wild. Okay, so we're not just talking about a bad cold here. The Black Death wasn't just a pandemic, it was a societal upheaval that wiped out millions, and in doing so, forced radical change. Imagine a world where roughly half the population just, poof, gone. Everything you thought you knew about society, economy, and even basic human interaction? Suddenly, it's irrelevant. This wasn't just a historical event, it was a geological-scale tremor that cracked the foundations of medieval life and inadvertently laid some surprisingly modern cornerstones. This plague didn't just kill people, it killed old ideas, old systems, and quite frankly, a lot of old habits that probably needed to go. Before we get into the chaos, let's meet our microscopic antagonist, Yersinia pestis. Sounds like a villain from a sci-fi movie, right? This tiny bacterium was the mastermind behind the bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague. It wasn't just a one-trick pony. This little germ primarily hitched rides inside fleas, who then found cozy homes on rats. And where do rats love to hang out? Anywhere humans are. So, essentially, humanity's own dirty habits and burgeoning trade networks created the perfect superhighway for this microscopic monster to take over the world. Talk about an uninvited guest. So, where did this party crasher originate? While specific patient zero details are fuzzy, because, no forensics back then, the consensus points to Central Asia. We're talking somewhere in the vast steppe lands, possibly near Kyrgyzstan, where the plague bacteria naturally existed in wild rodent populations. For centuries, it was just chilling in its natural reservoir, causing occasional local outbreaks. But then, something shifted. Maybe climate change, maybe increased human encroachment, woke the beast. And once it was awake, it was hungry for a global tour. It's like an ancient, deadly, extremely aggressive alarm clock. Once Yersinia pestis decided to leave its comfy Central Asian home, how did it get around? Enter the Silk Road, the original superhighway of global trade. This network of routes wasn't just for spices and silks, it was also an unwitting Uber service for plague-carrying rats and fleas. Merchants, caravans, soldiers, they were all inadvertently acting as biological delivery drivers, unknowingly ferrying the plague from oasis to oasis, from market to market. This intricate web of connections, which had brought so much prosperity, now became the very mechanism of its undoing, proving that sometimes, progress comes with a very steep, bubonic price. The Mongols, famed for their conquests, inadvertently played a huge role in the plague spread. In 1346, during their siege of the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, in Crimea, their army was decimated by the plague. In a truly grim, pioneering act of biological warfare, or perhaps just desperate pragmatism, they allegedly catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. While the effectiveness of this germ warfare is debated, the psychological impact was undeniable. Fleeing Genoese ships then became the ultimate vectors, sailing straight for Europe, bringing their cargo of spices, silks, and surprise, deadly bacteria. Imagine being on one of those Genoese ships, finally making it back to port after a terrifying voyage, hoping for safety. Little did anyone know, they were bringing the ultimate unwelcome souvenir. These ships, often filled with merchants, sailors, and most importantly, plague-infested rats in their cargo, docked in European ports. No one was checking for health certificates back then. It was a literal floating petri dish. These vessels became the primary conduit, transforming the plague from an Asian problem into a continental catastrophe, showing just how interconnected the world already was, even in the 14th century. The global economy had its perks, until it delivered the ultimate viral punch. The year is 1347. The place? Messina, Sicily. This vibrant port city, a bustling hub of trade, became Europe's ground zero. Ships from the east, laden with goods and disease, docked there, and within days, people started falling ill with grotesque symptoms. The Messina authorities, in a desperate but ultimately futile attempt to contain it, tried to expel the death ships, but it was too late. The fleas and rats had already disembarked, spreading the disease like wildfire through the city streets. It was the unfortunate beginning of a continental nightmare, a terrifying preview of the horrors that would soon sweep across the entire continent. From Messina, the plague didn't just walk, it sprinted. Italy, France, Spain, England, Germany, Scandinavia, no major region was spared. It followed trade routes, rivers, and roads, ripping through towns and villages at an alarming rate. It was a terrifying domino effect. People fled affected areas, thinking they could escape, but often just carried the disease with them to new, unsuspecting communities. This massive uncontrolled spread wasn't just a physical movement of disease, it triggered an unprecedented psychological shift, planting seeds of fear, distrust, and a chilling awareness of human fragility that would forever alter European society. Now for the grim numbers. Estimating the exact death toll from centuries ago is tough, but historians generally agree it was catastrophic. We're talking about roughly 30% to 50% of Europe's entire population. That's between 75 to 200 million people across Europe and Asia. Think about it, a world where every second person you know just vanishes. It wasn't just a population reduction, it was a demographic explosion in reverse, an almost unimaginable scale of loss that obliterated generations and left survivors grappling with a landscape utterly transformed. The sheer scale is almost too big for our brains to fully comprehend. While Europe often gets the spotlight, let's not forget the Black Death was truly a global pandemic. It wreaked havoc across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa long before and during its European rampage. From China to India to Egypt, bustling cities and vast empires faced similar devastation. The interconnectedness of the medieval world, through trade and conquest, meant that no major populated region was truly safe. This was not just a European crisis, it was a planetary reset, a testament to how profoundly a single pathogen could alter the course of human development across multiple civilizations, leaving a global scar. What did it feel like to get the plague? Not great, Bob. The bubonic form started with flu-like symptoms, followed by the terrifying appearance of buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpit, or neck, sometimes as large as an apple. These often turned black, hence Black Death. Then came fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and internal bleeding. Death usually followed within days. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs, spreading through airborne droplets, basically, coughing and sneezing, making it even more terrifyingly contagious. The septicemic form led to blood poisoning. It was a fast, agonizing, and truly gruesome way to go. Facing such an unknown, rapid, and deadly disease, what did medieval doctors do? Well, let's just say their methods were imaginative and mostly useless. They believed the plague was caused by bad air or miasma, astrological alignments, or divine punishment. So, remedies included bloodletting, purging, rubbing onions or dead chickens on buboes, drinking vinegar, or my personal favorite, sniffing herbs. They weren't just treating symptoms, they were trying to appease angry stars or evil humors. It's a testament to human resilience and desperation that anyone survived their treatments, let alone the plague itself. Science had a long, long way to go. One of the most popular cures was bloodletting. The idea was that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much blood, well, let's just drain some out. Doctors would cut veins or apply leeches, hoping to rebalance the body. In the context of the plague, which often caused internal bleeding and weakened patients, this was actively harmful. Imagine being sick, delirious, and then having a doctor intentionally make you bleed more. It's like fighting a fire with gasoline. It simply highlighted the profound lack of understanding of disease transmission, making things much, much worse. You've seen the images, the eerie, bird-like mask with a long beak, dark robes, and a stick to poke patients. These are the iconic plague doctors. While terrifying to look at, their outfits actually represented an early, though flawed, attempt at PPE. The beak was often filled with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, or camphor, meant to filter out the bad air or miasma they believed caused the disease. The leather cloak and gloves were supposed to protect them from direct contact. It was a fashion statement born of fear and flawed science, but it did show a glimmer of understanding that something needed to be kept out. Still, largely ineffective, but definitely a mood. The plague didn't just kill individuals, it decimated communities and tore apart the very fabric of medieval society. Families abandoned their sick, fearing contagion. Friendships dissolved, neighbors turned on each other, and basic human decency often evaporated under the immense pressure of survival. Imagine a world where the bonds of kinship and community, once the bedrock of existence, suddenly became liabilities. This widespread social breakdown forced people to reconsider their responsibilities, not just to each other, but to the state, and to themselves. It was a brutal lesson in self-preservation that reshaped social norms for generations. As the plague swept through the countryside, entire villages were wiped off the map. Homes stood empty, fields lay fallow, and livestock roamed untended. The sheer depopulation meant that once thriving rural communities became ghost towns, swallowed by nature. This wasn't just a sad sight, it had massive economic implications. Who would farm the land? Who would raise the animals? The feudal system, which relied on a large peasant workforce tied to the land, simply couldn't function anymore. The empty fields became a stark visual reminder of the radical demographic shift and the impending collapse of an entire economic order. Cities, with their cramped conditions and dense populations, were particularly vulnerable. When the plague hit, many wealthy citizens and even some clergy fled to the countryside, ironically sometimes carrying the disease with them. Those who remained faced unimaginable horror. Cities became centers of death, but also, paradoxically, points of transformation. While the immediate impact was devastating, the eventual rebirth of cities, built on new economic realities, would become crucial for the long-term changes the plague ushered in. This initial urban exodus highlighted a growing divide and reshaped the relationship between city and country. Here's where the real economic earthquake begins. With such a massive population drop, suddenly, there weren't enough people to work the fields, herd the sheep, or craft the goods. Imagine a world where labor, once abundant and cheap, became a precious commodity overnight. This dramatic scarcity of workers completely flipped the power dynamic. Before the plague, lords held all the cards. After, the surviving peasants and artisans realized their true value. This wasn't just a temporary dip. It was a fundamental shift that began dismantling centuries of economic hierarchy, paving the way for a more worker-centric economy. This labor shortage meant one thing for the survivors: demand for their work skyrocketed. Peasants, once tied to the land and exploited with low wages, could now demand better pay and conditions. Lords and landowners, desperate to keep their estates running, had no choice but to comply. This wasn't a gradual negotiation, it was an immediate, dramatic leap in the economic standing of the working class. Governments tried to impose wage freezes, because, of course, they did, but these were largely ineffective. The market dictated the terms, and the market said, "Pay up, or your fields will literally rot." This was revolutionary. On the flip side of skyrocketing wages, land value plummeted. With so many people gone, there was a surplus of land and very few people to work it or live on it. Suddenly, land, the traditional basis of wealth and power in the feudal system, wasn't as valuable. This meant that small landowners could acquire more land, and even some peasants could afford to buy their own plots, something previously unthinkable. This dramatic shift undermined the centuries-old feudal structure, where land ownership dictated social status. It was a massive redistribution of wealth and opportunity, laying groundwork for future agrarian reforms and new land economies. For those who survived, the plague opened up astonishing new avenues for social mobility. Previously, your social standing was largely determined by birth. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. But now, with so many vacancies, talented individuals from lower classes could step into roles of greater responsibility, skill, and wealth. Craftsmen could demand more for their specialized work. Women, too, found new opportunities in the workforce, filling gaps left by male deaths. This wasn't just a bump up, it was a seismic shift, allowing people to escape the rigid class structures and redefine their futures. A terrible price, but a profound change. Perhaps the most profound social change was the accelerated end of serfdom in Western Europe. Serfs were essentially bound to the land, working for a lord in exchange for protection and a place to live. Post-plague, with labor so scarce, serfs could simply run away and find better opportunities elsewhere, and lords couldn't stop them. The system collapsed because it no longer benefited the powerful. This wasn't just freedom for individuals, it was a fundamental redefinition of human rights and labor. The old medieval social order, rooted in agricultural servitude, was being dismantled, brick by brick, by a microscopic killer. Talk about unintended consequences. With no scientific explanation for the plague, people turned to the only framework they knew, religion. Why was God punishing them? Was it the end times? This sparked widespread religious fervor, but also profound questioning and despair. People flocked to churches, confessed sins, and sought divine intervention. But when prayers went unanswered and priests died alongside their flocks, faith began to waver. The church, once an unassailable authority, found its credibility challenged. This wasn't just a crisis of faith, it was a shakeup of spiritual authority that paved the way for future religious reforms and a more personal relationship with divinity. One of the most extreme religious reactions was the rise of the flagellants. These groups would march from town to town, publicly whipping themselves, believing that by self-inflicting pain, they could atone for humanity's sins and appease an angry God, thereby stopping the plague. They were a terrifying sight, often attracting large crowds and sowing both fear and fanaticism. While seemingly an act of profound devotion, the flagellants often spread the disease themselves, gathering crowds and traveling widely. Their rise showcased the desperation and spiritual chaos, but also the Church's inability to control extreme religious movements, further highlighting its weakening power. Tragically, fear and desperation often lead to scapegoating. With no understanding of germ theory, people looked for human explanations for their suffering. Jews were frequently accused of poisoning wells, and other minority groups, beggars, and foreigners also became targets of violence and persecution. This dark chapter highlights how easily society can unravel under extreme stress, with devastating consequences for innocent communities. These persecutions didn't stop the plague, but they did leave a legacy of prejudice and violence, further reshaping European social dynamics and planting seeds of intolerance that would malheureusement persist for centuries. The sheer scale of death, especially among the clergy, priests were often the first responders and thus highly exposed, left the Church severely weakened. Trust in divine intervention dwindled. The loss of educated clergy meant many new priests were poorly trained, further eroding the Church's intellectual and moral authority. This existential crisis forced the Church to re-evaluate its role and practices, contributing indirectly to movements that would eventually lead to the Reformation centuries later. The plague didn't just kill people, it opened the door for questioning, for independent thought, and ultimately, a transformation of religious power structures. Before the plague, Latin was the language of the educated, the church, and formal writing. But with so many educated Latin speakers gone, and a new demand for literacy among the rising merchant and artisan classes, vernacular languages, the everyday languages of the people, gained prominence. People needed to communicate, trade, and even read their own religious texts. This shift led to the flourishing of literature in English, French, Italian, and German, directly contributing to national identities and laying the groundwork for cultural awakenings. The plague inadvertently democratized language, paving the way for authors like Chaucer and Dante. The terrifying reality of death permeating daily life profoundly influenced medieval art. The danse macabre or dance of death became a popular motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, popes, in a grim dance. It served as a stark reminder of mortality, equality in the face of death, and the fleeting nature of earthly life. This morbid realism, however, also encouraged a greater focus on individual experience and human suffering, shifting artistic sensibilities from purely divine narratives to more human-centric themes, a subtle but critical transition towards the Renaissance humanism. Despite the initial blow to education with so many scholars and teachers dying, the long-term impact of the plague saw a surprising boom in new universities. Why? Well, with fewer people, there was more wealth concentrated among the survivors, and a demand for educated professionals to rebuild society. New endowments funded institutions, often with a more practical, less purely theological focus. This expansion of educational opportunities was crucial. It meant that knowledge could be disseminated more widely, fostering critical thinking and setting the stage for future intellectual advancements that would power the Renaissance. Education was literally rebuilt from the ashes. The sheer helplessness in the face of the plague, coupled with the failure of traditional remedies and religious explanations, inadvertently sparked a renewed interest in empirical observation and scientific inquiry. People began to question how diseases spread, even if they didn't fully grasp germ theory. This shift from purely theological or superstitious explanations to a desire for observable, measurable understanding was revolutionary. The plague pushed humanity to stop just praying for answers and start actively searching for them, planting the very first seeds of modern scientific methodology. It was a brutal, but effective, scientific kick in the pants. While true public health infrastructure was still centuries away, the Black Death did force communities to think about sanitation and disease containment in new ways. Cities began implementing rudimentary quarantines, isolating sick individuals and incoming ships, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. They also started to consider waste disposal and burial practices more seriously. These early, often desperate, measures were the very first crude steps towards understanding public health and preventative medicine. It was a hard lesson, learned through immense suffering, but it forever changed how societies would approach future epidemics, laying foundational concepts for health. Talk about learning the hard way. Let's just emphasize this again. The Black Death was the nail in the coffin for feudalism in Western Europe. The system, based on strict hierarchy and land ownership, simply couldn't survive the radical demographic and economic shifts. Labor scarcity, rising wages, social mobility, all these factors chipped away at the old order. While feudalism didn't vanish overnight, the plague accelerated its decline dramatically, setting the stage for centralized monarchies, nation-states, and entirely new economic systems like mercantilism and eventually, capitalism. It was a messy, brutal transition, but it irrevocably propelled Europe into a new social and economic era. Many historians argue that the Black Death, despite its horror, inadvertently cleared the ground for the Renaissance. The massive loss of life meant a redistribution of wealth and land, freeing up capital for art, science, and exploration. The questioning of traditional authority, both religious and secular, encouraged individualism and humanism. With fewer people, survivors often had more resources and motivation to invest in education, art, and innovation. It was a dark prelude to a dazzling rebirth, showing how even the most catastrophic events can, in their wake, create unforeseen opportunities for profound cultural and intellectual flourishing. It's not just about the bacteria, environmental factors likely played a role too. Some historians link the plague's severity and spread to the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of colder temperatures and increased rainfall that began in the early 14th century. This could have led to widespread famine, weakening populations, and making them more susceptible to disease. It also might have changed rat and flea migration patterns. It's a reminder that historical events are rarely monocausal. This environmental shift, combined with human activity, created a perfect storm for the plague to become the ultimate world shaper. It's a terrifying ecosystem of doom. Believe it or not, the Black Death might still be impacting your DNA. Recent genetic studies suggest that populations exposed to the plague developed increased resistance to the disease. Genes that offered protection against Yersinia pestis became more common in the gene pool of survivors. This is a fascinating example of natural selection in action, where a catastrophic event literally reshaped human biology over generations. So, parts of your immune system might be subtly wired by the ancestral trauma of the Black Death. Your ancestors survived, and they passed on those tiny, crucial advantages. Thanks, Grandma and Grandpa. The sheer devastation of the Black Death, and the absolute failure of medieval medicine, created an urgent, existential need for better understanding. It forced a critical reevaluation of medical practices and spurred a quest for knowledge that eventually led to the scientific revolution and the dawn of modern medicine. Concepts like germ theory, public sanitation, and epidemiology, while still centuries away, have their roots in the desperate lessons learned from the plague. We owe a huge debt to the suffering of those who came before us, who inadvertently laid the groundwork for the medical advancements we enjoy today. Talk about a painful, but profound, educational experience. The Black Death remains history's ultimate cautionary tale about the devastating impact of pandemics. Even today, the lessons learned from its spread and its effects inform our approaches to global health crises. Concepts like quarantine, isolation, and rapid data sharing, while vastly more sophisticated now, echo the desperate attempts of medieval communities. It's a chilling reminder that humanity is always vulnerable, but also capable of adapting and innovating in the face of microscopic threats. The Black Death didn't just transform the past, it continues to shape our present and future preparedness, reminding us to never, ever underestimate a tiny bug. Perhaps the most striking lesson of the Black Death is the power of unintended consequences. A bacterial infection, spread by fleas and rats, didn't just kill, it inadvertently sparked a chain reaction of social, economic, religious, and cultural shifts that laid the bedrock for the modern world. The death of millions accelerated the end of feudalism, empowered the common worker, spurred innovation, broadened educational access, and set Europe on a path toward the Renaissance and beyond. It's a brutal, complex paradox, immense tragedy leading to profound, sometimes beneficial, transformation. History, much like life, is full of these dark, unexpected twists. So there you have it. The Black Death wasn't just a plague, it was a global phenomenon that ripped through continents, decimated populations, and fundamentally reshaped the course of human civilization. It forced a brutal, unwanted reset on Europe and beyond, breaking down old structures, challenging established authorities, and inadvertently paving the way for a more dynamic, individualistic, and ultimately, modern world. From the origins of a tiny bacterium to the rise of new societal norms and even changes in our very DNA, its shadow and its unexpected light continue to stretch across the centuries. It's a chilling, yet compelling reminder of history's transformative power,